Hey, you guys. Thanks for joining. Want to say hello first, and thanks for joining this video for Mrs. Fall's class. We are in the midst of the COVID social distancing situation, and wanted to apologize for the backdrop, but I am in my home. I snuck off into the back room and so I could be away from the dogs and the rest of the family talking and watching television. Hopefully, if you hear any background noise, it won't be too terribly distracting. But thank you, Cooper Senior High, for watching this video. I have in the past attended Mrs. Fall's class for Cooper and discussed foster care and some politics behind it, some social issues, some political issues. And so for the next 45 minutes, that's what this is going to be about. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Dr. Vivian Dorsett. I am an assistant professor of criminal justice at Texas A&M University Commerce. I do live here in Cooper, and I lived here several years ago, raised my children here, moved away, finished raising my children, and moved back. So I've had the experience of wonderful Cooper, Texas. And but my specialty is in foster care, and I want to first tell you a little bit about me and my history and my background. Besides being a single mother, and then I'll discuss foster care on a state and federal level with you. I lived in foster care from age 2 until I aged out at 18. And I aged out. I lived in faith-based foster care, so I was never a ward of the state. That's what happens when you go under CPS, which is Child Protective Services. So my situation was a little unique. I'm the youngest of 6 siblings, and my 5 older siblings and I were raised actually by members in a church, and we lived with different families in this church. That's who my mother gave guardianship of us to in Fort Worth, Texas. So we lived with members in the church, and then we lived in one house, and we had members rotate, family that would come live with us for about a year, sometimes 2 years, and they would be our house parents is what we call them. And at one point we moved out to a group home in Keller, Texas called Christ Haven for Children, and it's still active, and it's a Church of Christ faith-based foster care group home. And that's where we lived, and I aged out after I graduated high school from Keller and left the children's home and went on into adulthood. I had what they call placements, is when you move or they move you or foster parents come in and out. I had 13 different placements, 13 different sets of families that I lived with from the age of 2 to 18. So if you calculate that right, it's a little... not quite 2 years. Every 2 years you were moving. So you have to imagine, even if you were with your own biological family, what that would be like if you had to move every 2 years. You leave your school. In our case, we might get separated from siblings. You leave your friends, your sports, everything that you've developed, your security, even though you're with your nuclear family. But just in our case, you move and you're not with your nuclear family. You're not with mom and dad. You're not with your siblings. And so you just have to kind of imagine how traumatic that might be for an individual. But that was my situation. I was clothed, I was taken care of, I was sheltered, I was fed. But the home atmosphere was a little upsetting. The home atmosphere was a little sad. And so I just dove into school. I dove into athletics. I dove into socializing and softball. I was a basketball player. I rodeoed. I hung out with friends, and that kind of kept me away from the house. And so that's how I lived. To keep my sanity. And I started working when I was 13. So I've worked since I was 13. And that was another thing, as I was able to get my driver's license, my car, and I had a 64 Chevy Impala. Think about that for a second. And that was one of the most metal big cars they could have made at that time. and it sure was hard when we ran out of gas because we'd have to push it to the gas station. And that's just a little high school memory. But I learned how to work. I learned how to make my money. I learned to keep busy. And that's kind of how I survived through foster care. I didn't gain my education until after I went through divorce, several relationships, 3 kids as a single mom, went back to school at age 32, gained my bachelor's and master's, which I never intended to even get a master's, and went on to get my PhD from Prairie View A&M University. So I gained my bachelor's and master's actually from Texas A&M Commerce, and then my PhD, all the while raising 3 kids single. My PhD from Prairie View A&M University in criminal justice and sociology, and I also have a theater background, and that's another story. But I do theater in a non-traditional way. I develop dramatic presentations about sociology and criminal justice. So that's kind of about me and what I do, and all my kids are grown. So let's talk about foster care for a second. You know, there's local issues, there's state issues, and there's federal issues when it comes to foster care. And I don't know if any of you know any kids in foster care. I don't think Delta County has a lot of foster care kids. I've had this conversation with some locals. But, you know, think about it for a minute and think, do you know why kids go into foster care? And I've asked people that, and people tend to think sometimes, oh, well, they're bad, or, oh, those bad kids in foster care. And I get a little annoyed when I hear that type of conversation, because that's not the reason kids get into foster care. There is a slight percentage of kids that go into foster care, they go into juvenile justice, they go into juvie, they get in trouble with the law, and then their parents drop them. You know, so their parents drop off, they're in and out of trouble, parents don't want to do anything with them anymore, so then they end up in the foster care system, and that's a very small percentage. And if any of you go on to criminal justice, you'll understand that that's crossover youth, or dual jurisdiction, meaning that they are in juvenile justice and they're in foster care. But child welfare, in the state of Texas, every state has their own child welfare system. And in Texas, it's the Department of Health and Human Services. They oversee, they're an umbrella organization that oversees child welfare, preschool, adult protective services. So we get CPS from the acronym of Child Protective Services. And the reason a child goes into foster care, or the reason that CPS gets called, are usually 3 things. 1, a child is abandoned. 2, a child is abused. 3, a child is neglected. So right now there's a good paradigm shift that's happening. And so this shift is trying to keep kids, supposed to keep kids with family. There was a federal act passed last year called Family First. So what's supposed to happen now is that if children have to be taken out of the home by CPS, there's an investigation done, they have a conclusion, or sometimes there's an emergency removal. Emergency removal might be if a family gets busted for doing drugs and there's kids in the home, police call CPS, they have to take the kids and they have to place them. Other than that, CPS is called by a neighbor or family. There's an investigation done. They go in, they look at the family, and they find out if this family's, are these kids being abused? Are they being neglected? Are they being fed? If, there's instances where a child is born in the hospital and they may be born to drug-addicted families, or it might be as simple, a drug-addicted mother, it might be as simple as the mother or the father just tested positive for drugs, and not even that they're an addict, but there's some sort of drug in their system, and CPS gets involved. So if they're removed from the home and they go into foster care, there's a thing called reunification. So what's supposed to happen now is reunification first, family first. If they're taken out of the home, they try to find family for these kids to go to. Family first. The next thing is, if kids are taken out of the home, if children are taken out of the home, teenagers, then they try for reunification. Reunification means that they're going to work on a family program to where these kids can eventually go back home. So they can fix whatever's wrong in the home and they can go back. So that's if they are removed. Now they can go under the jurisdiction of CPS and stay in the home. And a family plan is developed so that these kids can stay home with mom and dad or mom and fix whatever's wrong or whatever CPS deems is wrong. Come up with a plan, and then the kids don't get removed. But when the kids get removed, what happens a lot of times is if they can't find family, then they go to a stranger's home. And so you have to think about a kid, especially a little child, maybe even a teenager. But what trauma is caused by a kid being taken out of the home, even if it's for the well-being of the child, and a stranger picks them up, they're in a strange car, they go to a stranger's home. Now strangers know that they're protected and they're safe, but that child might be wondering what in the world's going on. So you can see the trauma that might set in with that. And also, if there's several siblings, if there's more than one, a lot of times they can't find an emergency placement for those kids in where they can all go into one home. So that's where sibling separation takes place. One kid goes here, one kid goes there. If you've got a sibling group of 4 or 5 or 6, they may go several different places. Again, trauma sets in. So they go to emergency placement, and then that might be for the night. That might be for 24 hours. That might be until they find a semi-permanent place. So maybe they're there a week. Then they go to another semi-permanent place. And maybe that works out for some reason. Maybe it doesn't work out. And then they get moved again. So this is where the placements start happening. And they kind of go from place to place. The difficult population to place are youth, teenagers. And they are at an age too where they might start to rebel, and family or the adults in the home can't handle it, or there's smaller children in the home. Lots of things can happen, lots of reasons, but that's where they go from place to place to place to place, right? So that's kind of what happens until either A, reunification happens and they get to go back home. And there's a lot of court processes that happens because this goes to court. There's a family judge studying family law in civil court, not criminal court, civil court, on what's going to happen to the children. And so it's a process that they have to go through. And they might get to go home and they might not. If they don't get to go home, then usually the parents' rights are terminated. So then what happens to the kids? I would tell you most kids that go into foster care are under the age of 5. That's the largest population, like 3 to 5, 3 to 6 years old. And those are often easier to place. And so it's easier to find homes. The challenge is adoption, because foster care was never set up for kids to be stuck in foster care until they turn 18 and they age out, or they go to high school and they graduate and they leave. Foster care was supposed to be a temporary situation until these kids can be taken care of or go back home. But what happens is they get stuck in the system for whatever reason. So the smaller kids are easier to place. They're easier to adopt. They do have group homes. They do have single homes. All these places have to be investigated and certified under Child Protective Services. So let's talk about, that's kind of what happens to a child. So let's talk about the state and federal. So the federal government passes what they might call an act, and they pass an act that is going to be placed into law, and then it trickles down to the states. And really, the only way the states are going to obey that a lot of times is if somehow funding is a part of that. And so a law may get passed, an act might get passed in Washington, D.C., and it's passed down to the states, and the states, will eventually, and sometimes it takes years for them to follow that law and implement it into their own state, make it work. That might have to do with medication that kids take. One that I was involved in. I'm on a lot of. I call myself a foster care alumni, and I'm in a lot of organizations and nonprofits that work with kids, and I work on helping laws. I've worked in the past on helping laws in Texas as well as federal laws, and I'm going to give you an example. In 2014, there was the Sex Trafficking Prevention and Strengthening Families Act. Let me say that again. The 2014 Sex Trafficking Prevention and Strengthening Families Act. Now, I was part of a policy group of foster care alumni that came to Washington, D.C. and gave recommendations to the Federal Health and Human Service Commission in D.C. on some improvements that need to make. In this particular one, and I'm going to speak about it because I was part of it, was the vulnerability of kids in foster care being sexually exploited while they were in foster care. These are some of the things that people don't think about. Now, prior to this act, there was no Amber Alert. We all know what Amber Alert is. If you have a cell phone, you get it on your phone, right? Kid goes missing, there's an abduction, they call Amber Alert. So there was no Amber Alert for a kid. Prior to this act, if a kid from foster care went missing, they got in trouble, they just called CPS. Police didn't deal with them. These are some of the issues that happen in foster care, kind of the unseen, unpopularized issues that happen. And what this act did is we were a policy group that came together, gave them recommendations, say, hey, here's some of the things that are going on in foster care, and here are some of the things that need to change. Now, foster care is what we call a marginalized population, a minority population that gets overlooked sometimes. Other populations like that might be women, LGBTQ issues, veterans, the elderly, populations that get overlooked that need someone to represent them. So this act gets passed. And now what has to happen? Because what was happening is kids in foster care, especially youth who run away, were being sex trafficked, considered child prostitutes. That term is not used anymore. A child under the age of 18 cannot consent to sex. Therefore, they are a victim and they are not a prostitute. When we change the terminology, we tend to change the way that the kids are looked at. So now they're looked at as a victim. So if they run away, two things have to happen. One, local law enforcement is called and there is a report filed. Number two, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC is the acronym, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, are automatically called. The 2014 Act mandated this. Prior to that, these kids were just lost in the system, especially if they are teenagers. So you have to think about it. If you're a social worker working for CPS, you have a caseload where you have 25, 30 cases, and you are having to see these kids every month, and you're having to do reports. A lot of times they're going to pay attention to the smaller, more vulnerable population than that older group, right? So that older group gets misplaced, put aside, especially if they continue to run away over and over again, right? Social workers are tired of it. They would sometimes actually close their case. They might still be 16, 17, young enough to be in foster care, and they've disappeared. So now those laws have changed. So that act has changed. That act is passed. It's passed down to the states, and the federal government is saying, okay, here's the minimal standards of what you have to do. You have to, one, if a child runs away, call NCMEC. Two, you got to call the police. Those are the kind of things that we help push and to make policy so that these kids can be represented because they couldn't represent themselves. So foster care alumni is just like veterans. You can compare it to veterans. A veteran who has gone to war and comes back and says, I was in that war. I was in that spot. I know what happened. I know what happens to us after war's over and what we go through. By the way, kids from foster care have a higher rate of PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, than PTSD. Anyway, look it up. Than men coming back from war. Let that sink in. The trauma that they face. So they may have faced trauma prior to going into CPS, and then they get into CPS and they face more trauma in different areas. And I'm not going to criticize all foster care parents. I know some very good foster care parents, some people that try really, really hard and do really good jobs. But there are foster care parents that don't do it for the right reason. There are people who become foster parents because they know they get money for it. They get a monthly stipend for every child that they have. They also get an increase if they have that child who needs special services, such as mental health. Let's say they're bipolar. One of the things that used to happen is a child will go into foster care, they're traumatized, they throw fits, they don't want to be there, they may not behave, they might run away, they might throw fits, they might scratch, they might throw things, so they take them to the doctor does a diagnosis, now they're diagnosed, and they give them medication. So another thing that we fought in the state of Texas was psychotropic medication. That's the medication that's given to a kid to try to control that behavior. Now, that behavior can be temporarily because of the situation they're in. But what happened, and still happens at times, is that medication is given to them and they never take them off the medication. They don't try to work with the kid. They keep them medicated, they keep them sedated, they keep them controlled, and it follows them all the way through foster care until they get older. And that is the overuse of psychotropic medication. It's another issue that happens in child welfare. So, as advocates, because that's what I consider myself, I'm an advocate, a community advocate that pushes for positive change and awareness in the foster care system to improve, what we say is to improve services and resources for children in the child welfare system. We sometimes call them our brothers and sisters in the child welfare system. There's another population that's not always paying attention to and not always taken care of, and that's what we call the transitioning age. That age is from age 15 as they are starting to transition into adulthood. There are programs set up called Preparation for Adult Living that help assist this population, because you have to think about it. I'm going to just stop and think for a minute. As you are growing up, there's certain things that your mom and dad do for you, or maybe your grandparents, maybe your aunt and uncles, maybe an older sibling, but there's someone in your family that teaches you some things about becoming an adult. So stop and think a second, what are those? What are those things? You learn to cook. Mom and dad finally let you in the kitchen. Mom lets you help. You learn to shop. You go grocery shopping. You learn how to shop for your clothes. You learn how to manage money. Sometimes they start that at a very early age. You learn how to manage money. They let you open a bank account. And you have a bank account or a savings account. You have money to spend. You have money waiting for you when you get out of high school. You might start a job. You start working. You have income. When you get a job, you realize you have to have a Social Security card. And then you realize, well, you become 16, 15, what do? You kind of start driving. Dad puts you behind the wheel of the truck, right? Lets you drive out in the field. That's kind of how we learned at the children's home. We learned on a stick shift, driving a truck. You learn how to drive. You know, your parents take you and you get your driver's license, and then you can work. Then they might purchase you a car. So these are some things that in foster care are called Preparation for Adult Living, or PAL, P-A-L, it's the acronym. So these are some of the things in foster care that some kids don't get, right? So the state is split up into 12 regions. Each region has what they call a preparation for adult living office. And what they do is you're supposed to bring kids in starting at the age of 15. If they're not being taught these things at home, that they come in and they take classes for this. And they have specialists come in, teach them how, chef teaches them how to cook, community gets involved. This is what's supposed to happen. And then when they finish, they get a stipend, they get a certificate. But what also happens sometimes is they learn these things. First of all, if they're not already learning them in the home, I can almost bet you that when they go to the classes and they learn them and they come back to the house to try to apply what they're learning, it doesn't happen. They're not allowed in the kitchen. Foster parents aren't going to sit down with them and teach them how to budget, aren't going to drive them back and forth to work because they don't want to. They're busy with other kids. There's not the transportation. There's not enough time. But these are the kind of things that if you're going to foster a child, that you have to be prepared in your home, that you have to treat this child like it was your own. What would you do for your own child? That's what we call normalcy. In the Strengthening Families Act, the part of the act that says strengthening families was that these children, they deserve to have as much normalcy as possible that you would give your own kid. What also comes with that is social involvement. Now, one of the things that happens to kids in foster care is there's not a lot of social bonding that happens, because you have to think about it. As soon as they get close to each other, and I'm speaking from my own experience, but I've talked to kids coming out of foster care that have had 30 placements, gone to 20 different schools. Every time they get close to somebody, they get pulled away, right? So eventually, you don't get close to people. You just block that off. You don't go there. So there's no social bonding. There's no social skills that happen. You get out to society, they're thrown out at 18 because at 18, legally, the state doesn't have jurisdiction of them anymore. Now, some states, and luckily Texas is one of those, some states will allow a child to stay in foster care until the age of 21. Does that mean they stay with a foster parent? Not always. If the foster parent says yes, they can stay there, or they go off to college. The other thing that happens is called an adult living center. So now they have these facilities set up all around the state that are popping up, and they will take care of a child in foster care from age 18 up until their 22nd birthday in an adult facility with other adults their age, help them get jobs, help them if they're going to school, give them housing, because there is a large homeless population of youth that come out of foster care. So a lot of them at 18, the foster parent says, done. Or if they're in a facility or they're in a group home, something like that, they're done. So they have to go out, and a lot of times they don't want to go anywhere else. They don't want to go to another facility. They don't want anything else to do with CPS. They're done. They had a horrible experience, and they end up homeless. Or they end up what we call couch surfing. Maybe they go and they meet biological family, and it works out great. And a lot of times it doesn't work out great. You know, that relationship isn't there. It wasn't there their entire childhood, and it's not there as an adult. So they realize that, so then they bounce and they couch surf from house to house to house. It's called couch surfing. Trying to get on their feet, trying to get a job, trying to get a home, trying to get a car. I mean, think about if you were trying to do all of that without any parent's assistance, and you were just thrown out there to the wolves. It's rough. You know, those are some of the things they experience. So not only should they not age out of foster care, that they should either be reunified or they should be adopted. They age out of foster care, and then they have to face adult life on their own. And how do you do that? How do you navigate that? And if you're lucky enough to go to college, and a lot of them are, because in the state of Texas, you know, some states are done at 18. Some states do not help them get into college. Texas is better. Texas keeps them in till the age of 22, and If they go to a public institution, the state pays their tuition and their fees. So their education is paid for. But another issue is they are trying to transition out of being a teenager into this adult life and be at college. Could you imagine? Some of you are going off to college. Could you imagine if you went off to college and you were taken and you were dropped off at college knowing you're never going to return home? Some college students experience going to college and coming back home, and mom and dad's already changed their bedroom into an office. I've had college students tell me they went home for Christmas break and mom and dad changed their bedroom into the doggy room. Funny things like that happen. But they at least have a home to go home to. These kids sometimes they get stuck, so they don't have anyone for holidays. They don't have anybody celebrating them going off to college. Some do. Some have very good foster care parents that stay with them, that give them that space to come back. But so now they're transitioning into adulthood, going to college, trying to navigate that on their own. And when you become a freshman in college, you'll experience this. And it can be a difficult time. And so there's services to try and help this population through the preparation for adult living. And about statistics are different. There's a lot of research on it. Some of them will say that kids coming out of foster care, 40 to 60% have aspirations of attending college. And college isn't for everyone. And if it's not for them, they shouldn't be forced there so that they'll have housing and they won't end up homeless, right? They should find jobs. They could stay at one of the adult living facilities. They could go to training schools, get a trade, things that are going to work for them. When I came out of high school, I went to cosmetology school. And then I went to college for a year. And then I said, forget all this, got a job and started working again. But I had siblings. That was lucky because I at one point lived with every one of my siblings at some point in my young adult life. And so I was lucky that they had a couch for me to sleep on. When I left the children's home, that's what I did actually, is I went to my sister's house. She lived in an apartment and I paid her $20 a week. I was in cosmetology school. I worked at Kroger 15 hours a week, had a car, and I would pay my sister $20 a week to sleep on her couch. That's what I did for 9 months after high school. Slept on my sister's couch. Had a little closet in the corner. Had my clothes in there, or half of them in my car. But I didn't care because I was free. I was out of the children's home and I was doing what I wanted to do and I didn't have to follow anybody else's rules. Boy, did I not know much. But what you don't realize is a lot of kids come out and they realize there's no going back. And I'll tell you a story about a young man that I helped. When I was at Prairie View A&M University, I started a group, a foster care student group. And I had a student that contacted me, it was January. And he came looking for me, and the university called me at home and said, there's this young man looking for you, and he really needs somebody to talk to. And I spoke to him, and I went up to the university actually and sat with him because I could tell over the phone that he was not in a good place. And I found out later that he was suicidal. But he talked to me and he said, I live with the same family from the age of 5. When I graduated high school, he lived in Dallas. They put him on a Greyhound bus to Prairie View A&M University to go to school. I mean, can you imagine if you were your freshman year and you were going off to college and your parents put you on a bus? Put him on a bus. He goes to school. At Christmas break, they tell him, we're not going to be home. We'll be traveling, so you're going to have to find somewhere else to go. And he told me, he said, that's when I realized what foster care was all about. Now again, there are good stories out there. I have heard way more negative stories than I have positive. he was one of those that had been put on psychotropic medications, and it followed him all the way through school. And when he got into college, he didn't know how to deal with his mental health issues. Wasn't taking his medication on a regular. He'd quit, he'd go, he'd take it, he'd fall asleep in class. He was just a mess. And he went into his room and he brought me this big gallon bag. And I said, bring me your medications. Let's see if we can figure this out. He brought me a bag that had 30 prescription bottles in it. I was like, Jesus Christ. So we start separating them. He came over and actually went to my son's basketball game with me, and we went to Whataburger, and I sat there, went through all these bags. My goodness. And I talked to him, and, you know, I think in a way that changed his life. He just needed someone to care. He didn't finish school. He fell, you know, stumbled, made a few bad choices, but now he's married and he has a kid and he's working. And it really just took someone that he could talk to, someone had told him about me and he came looking for me, and that could help him navigate what to do in life. And he also became an advocate and went to Austin with me and spoke at some hearings. So when politics is involved, let's talk about that for a second. We got about, 5, 6, 7 more minutes. What happens for a law to get passed, and some of you, have learned this in political science, is it gets presented and then it gets written, and our legislators, and you should vote, our legislators, every legislator, representative, senator, etc., Republican, Democrat, whatever, they all put on a committee. So there might be a railroad commission committee, something to do with food, something to do with health, education, etc. They have all these committees. They have a health and human service committee, and that's where the laws get passed for CPS, foster care. And so I've been several times. They'll have a hearing. They'll have a bill that someone wants to pass into law. And so they'll have people come and speak, and citizens like you and I, and they will go down and they will have a hearing, and that committee will all sit around in a circle and they'll listen to people speak. So former foster care kids come in and they speak about their personal experiences and what needs to change and what they went through. And before this, laws were just being passed by people that were not experiencing. I mean, could you imagine laws being passed for a veteran by a group of people that were never vets? Or laws being passed for females by a group of men? I mean, could you imagine that? So what needs to happen, and what we have said, is that foster care alumni have to be at the table when these laws are being passed and when these decisions are being made. Since I'm an educator, one of the things I was able to do was speak at a hearing where there used to be a law that kids had to go to college by the age of 21. And so we spoke on behalf of this group all across the state that, look, these kids don't always have their self together by the age of 21. So let's push that law. So now it's the age 23. It might have even got moved up to 25. But they pushed that law up that said, hey, we're going to give you until the age of 23 or 25, and you just have to start college. If you don't make it and you don't graduate, then you can always come back. So some statistics came out that even though these kids were going to school, 40 to 60% of them had aspirations of graduating, maybe 20 to 30% of them graduate with an associate's, but only like 4 to 10% were graduating with a 4-year degree. I mean, let that sink in. I mean, sometimes we talk about retention rates in universities where 50% of the kids graduate. That's kind of an average. In category of foster care kids, so they're wondering, okay, what is happening that these kids are not graduating college? And it goes back to not having resources, getting to college and not having food, getting depressed and getting stuck in your room, not having anywhere to go, not being able to buy your books. I mean, just different things. The thing about foster care kids is they do not reach out for help, right? They don't know where those resources is. A lot of them don't even want campuses to know they're from foster care because they want to leave that behind. They want to start a new life. They want to be something different. They don't want to be labeled as a foster care kid, right? And so there's a lot of things that they go through. So, trace this back. In our state, we have laws that get passed to help support. And then we have federal laws that happen federally that get trickled down to the states, and they have to choose how to use them or not. But if a state chooses to give them public education, that comes out of the state funding. But there are also federal funding that can help them. So one of the other things that happens in the state of Texas is a couple of more laws passed. One is every K through 12 independent school district has to have a foster care liaison that tracks that child as they come into their school system, or if they move out of their school system and have to move and go to another one, that helps them get all their paperwork through. The Higher Education Coordinating Board also passed that for higher education. Now, every college and university has to have a liaison. Just like veterans offices, they now have to have a liaison that helps foster care kids transition and navigate higher education and helps them with resources. And there's state resources, there's federal resources, there's financial aid, just like other people may get. You have to fill out the application. But there's assistance for them. And a lot of kids come out of foster care, they don't know this. The other thing is they come out of foster care and maybe they're having a bad experience coming out of foster care. And I talk to you about this population a lot because this is where my advocacy lies. And there's a state law that they're supposed to have, a driver's license, a social security card, their birth certificates, all these things that they need to live into adult life that often foster care parents don't get for them. Especially if they're having bad experiences and the kids get, kicked out or they run away. And so they have rights. So those are some of the rights that a kid in foster care have. The other thing you have to think about is a kid is in foster care at the maximum 18 years of their life. They have 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way. People are living into their 80s or 90s. Think about how they have to end up living in an adult life without family, right? Without support, and navigating that and making that happen all by themselves. So you have local, where CPS have regions and they cover certain areas. You have state laws, organizations, facilities, etc. And then you have federal. They don't cross, the states don't cross lines. What's eligible for a child in Texas is not eligible and the same for a child in Louisiana, Oklahoma. If you go into social work, a lot of social workers go into wanting to help with CPS. And it's not easy. A lot of them, they want to go, they want to help, they have really good intentions, and then they get into this overburdened system. They see things that are wrong. They see the sadness of the families. They see the sadness of the kids, and it can work on your mental health. It can be very, very difficult. So I want to challenge you, if you choose to go into the social sciences of social work, sociology, to really investigate before you make a decision of where you're going to go work. Do an internship, if it's paid or not, and that always opens the door for you to do an internship and really fill it out and look and see if you feel this is for you. Now, one of the things that we're about to wrap up the 45 minutes, and I hope this is okay and you learned something. We're about to wrap up, but I want you to think about this population out there in society. Think about what you can contribute, maybe not to this population, but to someone else. I'm a huge advocate for being involved in your community and seeing what you can do to help improve. If it's not foster care, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the air, maybe it's agriculture, things like that. But we're about to wrap up. I want to thank you for listening to me and going this far. And do you have any questions? No? Okay, then. I guess we're done. You can save those questions for Miss Falls. She'll get them to me. Maybe I can answer them. Thank you for listening.